we will also be recording this. So you'll be able to access this at any point in the future. But again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me.
Great. Well, it's a little past 1, so I'd say we can go ahead and get going. I'm gonna, before I do my intro, I want to pass it off to Kelsey Wallace to give us do a quick land acknowledgement.
Hello, everyone. Huaka huinga jugutunga mamtresa gomyungunga dawam mani Eagle River ami witatunga. Hello, everyone. My name is Kelsey Jugun Wallace. I'm originally from Mamdresak, or Bethel, Alaska, which are the lands of the Kuskokwim River Yupik people. I am currently the Communications Director for Native Peoples Action and NPA Community Fund. And currently my family and I live in Eagle River on Dena'ina Ishnenya, or the land of the Dena'ina people. In opening this afternoon, we just want to take a moment to first honor the people and lands that we live and do business on. I know that we are all over the state right now, but these lands that we live in reciprocity and harmony with are Indigenous lands, and they have always been. So right now, we just want to encourage you, if you do know whose Indigenous lands that you live on, feel free to drop them in the comment box. And if you don't know, we encourage you to seek out and learn who the first peoples are of the lands that you live on. And just give thanks to the lands and the waters that provide so much for our people and have provided so much for us for thousands of years. So with that, just want to say Qoyana Jaknak to everybody for joining today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Kendra Kloster, I'm the Executive Director of Native Peoples Action. We're one of the hosts along with Native Movement and ACPERG, Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, and the Alaska Center, and we appreciate everyone being here today. I live up here in Anchorage, although I'm originally from Wrangell and Juneau, and just working through our new life here of living in quarantine at the moment. So I just want to say I hope everyone is safe and doing well, and I know these are crazy times. I really appreciate everyone getting online here to have this really good conversation. The plan for today is just an opportunity for us to learn about the budget, what's in the budget, and what the vetoes are, and what does this mean for Alaskans. We're going to open up with Senator Kiehl. He's going to provide an overview of the budget, what the vetoes are, some highlights of Southeast. Representative Zulkosky is going to talk about some impacts to rural Alaska and some other things that she might want to highlight. And then moving to Representative Chris Tuck, and he can also do some highlights on the budget and the vetoes. And it's great that we have a good panel from all over the state. And like I said, we've got other legislators on the line. Do I see Senator Begich joined us too? All right. So you guys can have an opportunity too, if there's things that you feel like we've missed or you want to chime in about, have that opportunity as well. And then really going to a Q&A. So the public that wants to ask questions, we encourage you to do that. In the message box, you can message your question. And I know for some people that might be on the phone that are not on their computer. If you have a question too, you can send it to us at info@nativepeoplesaction.org. And we'll try to, at some point, unmute the call lines to see if there's some questions that we can open up that you guys can ask. So great, thank you again for being here. And I'm just going to pass it off over to Jesse. Oh, and one other thing, we did say that this is going to be recorded. and then we're going to post it. And so if there are follow-up questions that we don't get to, please provide us your information in the chat box or send us an email and we'll get you answers to those questions. Take it away, Jesse.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kendra and Veri and Louie and David. I appreciate you hosting this and bringing folks together today. My name is Jesse Kiehl. For those of you I haven't had the privilege of meeting, or in the case of Senator Gardner, good to see you again. And I am privileged to serve in the Alaska State Senate. I represent District Q, which is all of the city and borough of Juneau, and then all of Glacier Bay with the community of Gustavus, Haines and Cluckwan, and Skagway as well. These are the traditional lands. I stand now on the traditional lands of the Auk Tlingit. To the south, I represent Taku Tlingit land and other traditional homelands of Tlingit people out to Bristol Bay, where the Chukanadi Brown Bear people once lived, now removed to Huna, and up north to the Canadian border, the lands of the Jilkat Kwan in the eternal village of Cluckwan. A partial listing of some of the communities I'm honored to represent. And so my thanks, Gunashchish, to the traditional caretakers and people of this land where I get to stand today. Talking to you from my office in the state capitol building, which is largely locked down, so I get to come in to work. My children are doing their schooling from their bedrooms and the living room couch. My wife has a computer on the dining table, so we eat where we can. Thank you, everyone, for taking an interest in the budget in these difficult times. Very briefly, I guess the overview picture is that the way the state of Alaska makes its living and what we as Alaskans do together through our government is deeply challenged. These are tough times, not just for the economy, but for the state and the state services Alaskans need. Last year, after all the back and forth over vetoes and reinstatement, and then the tremendous supplemental budget the governor submitted, quietly acknowledging that his vetoes were unachievable in almost every respect, when you put it all together, the state spent, or rather through June 30th this year, the state will spend about it's about $4.6 billion of unrestricted general funds. Oil will bring in something on the order of $1.3 billion, plus or minus. That, you know, the current state of the price of oil means that number is down. I'm ballparking it at 1.2, 1.3. We will get from our sustainable draw on investment earnings from the Alaska Permanent Fund about $3.2 billion, I think, 3.3. And we will draw a significant amount from our last savings account, the Constitutional Budget Reserve. That fund's a pretty inadequate budget, to be perfectly frank. After the governor's vetoes and the reinstatements, we are still left with a state budget that struggles very much. Our K-12 schools have not seen an adjustment for inflation in, I believe, 4 years at this fiscal year, 5 years next. In fact, next fiscal year, they'll take a reduction in nominal dollars, to say nothing of the cost increases they'll face from inflation. Our university has suffered deep cuts, with more to come this coming fiscal year. When you put it all together, next fiscal year's budget should be about $4.4 billion in unrestricted general funds. But that's before we do anything like fight wildfires, which last year cost us more than $100 million in state money. There are always unanticipated expenses, and it's wise to be ready for them. So the budget is essentially flat, which means it's going to lag inflation this coming year. That includes a $1,000 permanent fund dividend payable this fall. That number was a compromise, and as usual, one of the more controversial things the legislature worked on. There were a tremendous number of legislators who believed that the fiscal picture was so dire we should not pay a dividend this coming fiscal year. Others believed, as the governor does, that the almost 40-year-old statutory formula is the law of the land and what should be funded above and before all other priorities. The final result was $1,000 payable this fall. We also, of course, did a tremendous amount of work on the coronavirus pandemic and the state's response to that emergency. We put a tremendous amount of money into the state's disaster relief fund and appropriated a lot of money that the governor requested into some specific emergency funds for the Department of Health and Social Services and other state responses to the coronavirus. Outside of that pandemic, and I don't want to minimize how important it is to all of our communities and all of the economy around the state, we did some other things looking down the road at the next year and what the state will need to do in the budget to provide for what Alaskans need. Particular to coastal Alaska and the areas I represent, including down to our border with Canada in the south at Dixon Entrance and out up through Prince William Sound and out the Aleutian Chain. We put a lot of money into the budget to fix our ferries. The marine highway system has been in absolute crisis with communities completely cut off, and the kind of economic damage that the state is suffering from a shutdown of movement all this last winter for a tremendous number of communities that depend on the marine highway system. The governor frankly vetoed most of that, which was deeply disappointing. We also put significant additional money into the ferry system budget to run the ferries once they're repaired. The governor vetoed the majority of what we added back, although after his vetoes, the budget is still for somewhat better ferry service than we had this last year. The legislature saw fit to increase the governor's budget proposal in fisheries management in a number of places to make sure that we can keep an eye on the sustainability of our fish and game species. The governor didn't propose much in the way of cuts to wildlife management, but fisheries management. He reduced some of that back, but the end result was a more robust fisheries science and fisheries management budget than he originally proposed. He also got out his veto pen in a number of areas. I mentioned earlier K-12 education. The legislature proposed flat funding education. The governor vetoed his way back to the $30 million reduction, fewer dollars this coming fiscal year than we have in this year. He also had proposed a $25 million cut to the University of Alaska system statewide. While the legislature passed only half that cut, we still sent him a reduction. He took his veto pen to it and went back to his $25 million cut. That will have dire impact, I think, on Alaska in the long term. The legislature provided some very small additional investments in pre-K, in early education, most of which the governor vetoed. He also eliminated, after proposing that the state only pay about half of what it owes for school bond debt reimbursement, the legislature funded all of what the state owes, and the governor vetoed 100% of it, including everything he had originally proposed. That's one of the things, along with the school funding, that he has claimed can be paid for with federal coronavirus disaster money. The way I read the law, the way Legislative Legal Services reads the law, the way Legislative Finance Division read the law, that's not allowable. And so we're going to have some serious ongoing discussions about what we do with his proposals to use that money that way. Even if it is allowable, it's a very strange choice to use money that the federal government has sent to help Alaskans through a pandemic emergency for our annual operating expenses. If we do that, if he succeeds in that, it's not available to help with pandemic emergency costs. Was a strange choice. Another place the legislature differed strongly with the governor is that we reinstated funding for public broadcasting. The very small amount that we passed last year, after years and years of cuts, and that he vetoed down to zero, we reinstated and he vetoed down to zero again. It was about a little more than $2 million for public radio statewide, about $600,000 for the 4 public TV stations, Anchorage, Fairbanks, Bethel, and Juneau. That money also helps enable Gavel to Gavel Alaska. If all of that Gavel to Gavel service is paid for by the city of Juneau, but it really depends on having a TV station in the capital city that the city can hang Gavel to Gavel on top of. Without that funding, frankly, the legislature's accountability to you, the public, is at great risk. If you can't see what goes on, it's going to be tough. We will struggle with that on a local level and try and figure out what to do so that you can always see what your legislators are up to and what the governor's up to when the legislature's in session. He also vetoed the entirety of the money for the community assistance program. We used to call that revenue sharing. We've changed the name periodically, but it's the same program. That is a critical program to our smallest communities. It's helpful in larger communities. It helps keep property taxes down, but in smaller Alaska communities, it keeps the lights on. It keeps a part-time city administrator out chasing grants and collecting utility bills and the other things that are just essential. Things that the state would face colossally higher costs if we had to try and provide for small rural communities from a state level. He also reduced a grant for special needs housing through the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation and some money for homelessness prevention, which, first of all, in the time of a virus pandemic, the more homeless folks you can keep, or potentially homeless folks you can keep housed and out of terrible situations where they're living rough and congregating for safety, the safer those folks can be from the possibility of a virus being transmitted between and among them. And then the other thing that the legislature did that the governor vetoed was we proposed protecting $1 billion that's currently in the permanent fund earnings reserve by moving it into the corpus of the fund. That constitutional protection makes sure that it can't be overspent. The permanent fund has taken a terrible hit with the investment markets in the last couple of months. This is not the time to draw more than a sustainable amount. I usually object to sports metaphors, but I'll try one anyway. You don't, if you hit the boxer when he's trying to get up off the mat from his knees, you're going to knock him out. The permanent fund has been staggered. We can take a sustainable draw and provide a $1,000 PFD and the services Alaskans need, but we can't keep that up if we hit the fund when it's down. The governor didn't spend that money, but he refused to let us protect it permanently. I'll just point to two pieces of legislation, if I may, before I hand over the mic, that I'm really proud to say the legislature put a stop to. Not the only bad ideas out of the governor that the legislature put the kibosh on, but two that I was particularly proud to help slow down that had to do with Alaska's public land. Of the 105 million acres the state has, the governor proposed two bills, one of which would let any Alaskan propose just about any land to be sold into private hands, and the other of which would let the state sell that land for, depending on the year, 25 cents on the dollar for what it's worth, or arguably in the coming year, 16 cents on the dollar. And the legislature declined to forward those bills. I think that's important as we Alaskans think about our public land and our access to the resources we all use, our access to the recreation that we all love. It's important to be thoughtful and careful about where we put state land into private hands and not start an ill-advised and financially irresponsible land grab rush. So with that, I know I've probably talked a little longer than I was supposed to. Thank you so much for letting me kick off today, and I look forward to the other presentations and then taking questions.
Representative Zulkosky can go ahead with her comments. Make sure, Veri, that we unmute her, please.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. First, I want to begin by thanking Kendra at Native Peoples Action for reaching out to me and inviting me to participate. It gave me a good opportunity to remember what it feels like to wash my hair. I want to say it's great to see everyone, even though we're convening in different ways. I think it's important that we continue to come together, even though we're doing it independently in our own homes, to engage about important topics. My name is Tiffany Zulkosky. I was born and raised in Bethel. I am proud to represent District 38 in the Alaska State House. My district is my home community of Bethel, as well as over 30 villages along the Kuskokwim and a couple of villages on the Yukon River. I am proud to be part of the Alaska House Bush Caucus, as well as be part of a legislature that is engaging for the first time in our state's history on issues related to tribal affairs. I know everyone's attention has been focused on staying healthy, but I also think that it's important, as Senator Kiehl talked about, to have conversations about the budget that's been coming forward and what it means to meet Alaska's needs right now. I was very disappointed, but not surprised by the governor's vetoes again this year. I believe that it takes a time to put politics ahead of good public policy when we should really be coming together to protect Alaska's families and when people are really needing that help the most. This year is my third session, and I have heard from much more seasoned legislators that this year we passed a budget in record time, which was about 68 days. It was largely bipartisan, with mostly broad support in both the House and the Senate. I agree with Vice President Joe Biden in that a budget is a values document. So any politician can stand up and talk about what's important to them, but you really find out what matters to a legislator or to a governor when it comes to how they spend state money and the types of programs that they support. And it's for those reasons that I fight as hard as I do with regard to protecting Medicaid funding, investment in the Village Public Safety Officer Program, public broadcasting, power cost equalization, public education, and much more, because not only are those programs essential for my district, rural communities, and the state as a whole, for some of our areas in rural Alaska in particular, this type of funding really keeps the fabric of a community pulled together. Something that I've talked a lot about with regard to budgeting when I'm in the Capitol is the difference between equity and equality. We talk about equality, or the importance of treating everyone equally, and providing the same, whether it's the same funding resources or the percentage of investment that we're making, that equality is an important value, and that's very true. But equity is also equally important. Equity does not believe that everyone in every community comes to the table or comes to where they are from the same starting line. So there are several communities, and a lot of them are in rural Alaska, that do not have the same level of resources that we see in urban areas of the state. So as I look at decisions regarding Alaska's budget, I always want to make sure that we're making decisions based on what is most equitable. Are we providing the resources that we need to ensure every Alaskan has every opportunity to have access to quality education and other state-funded resources that we provide across the state? I also believe that it's really important to make sure that we pass a reasonable budget to ensure that as budgets get cut, more often than not, rural districts are hit hard and they're hit fast. Like I was mentioning, because we don't always start at the same starting line, especially in Village, Alaska, there's not the level of safety net and buffer that protects our residents in Alaska in rural areas as there are in other parts of the state that have the opportunity to have greater resources in their communities. One thing I want to make sure that we talk about in the context of the budget is that there are a lot of people that believe the legislature keeps passing bloated budgets. But the reality is that the legislature passed a budget that's the smallest budget that's been passed in Alaska in nearly 15 years. It's 40% smaller than the budget that we passed in 2013. And our fiscal condition was struggling well before we were faced with responding to this public health emergency, which we now know is causing great economic hardship because we don't have the resources to respond to this public health emergency. The best thing that we can do is shelter in place and close down certain sectors of our communities in order to keep Alaskans healthy and strong. I do want to underscore that the challenges that we're faced with COVID-19 is really a public health emergency first, and that's having economic hardship subsequently to that. If we can talk about making sure that we protect Alaska's economy all day and all night, but if Alaskans are losing their lives to this pandemic, that's one thing that we can't recover from. I also want to say that we've cut the budget to the bone, and we really can't afford to make any more additional cuts without severe consequences. Senator Kiehl talked a bit about a number of budget vetoes that we saw this year that impact rural Alaska. So some of this might be a little bit redundant, but I want to underscore the importance of why these funds are so essential to rural Alaska. In addition to the entirety of the school bond debt reimbursement, the governor also vetoed over $36 million intended for REAA funding, which, because of our school's small size, REA funds are ensuring that students in smaller communities have the resources that they need to have additional education services. As we all know, providing education in a village outside of Bethel is going to be significantly more expensive than it might be in a larger community that has lower power costs, less turnover of their teachers. So this funding is really important to providing education equity for rural students. In addition to what Senator Kiehl said regarding Alaska public media, the governor vetoed over $2.5 million for Alaska public media. And what I know is that in my district, public media is one of the main sources of how people access information. So if people don't have public television, they're not going to be able to know what's going on in the news. And so often public radio provides the lifeblood of information for ensuring that Alaskans know what's happening in their state and what's happening in their communities and even their regions. I was disappointed to see there was $250,000 or $250,000 in grant funding that was given to the Alaska Municipal League to help implement the Real ID requirements throughout rural Alaska. We had a couple of hearings on Real ID implementation in rural Alaska in tribal affairs this year, and the administration is very behind the curve in making sure that rural Alaskans have equitable access to DMV services and state services to ensure that they can get on an airplane and be able to travel. I was gravely concerned about the over $30 million veto that was put forward for the Medicaid funding. We know that Medicaid is a key driver of Alaska's healthcare system and has been a pillar in our economy that's kept Alaska out of a recession or has helped us to recover from a recession. Last year, the governor cut funding for Medicaid so deeply that we had to circle back this year and pass one of the largest supplemental budgets in state history. I'm very disappointed that he would again cut Medicaid, particularly in the midst of a global pandemic that is related to health services at its core. We're seeing a decline not only in economies outside of the health industry. We know that hospital systems are also seeing a decline in their patient volumes because of the impacts that COVID-19 is posing on communities. And so it's important now more than ever to make sure that we provide the resources that we need to our hospital systems. I won't talk again about the community assistance. I was also gravely disappointed in the veto on the legislature work this year to provide an additional $30 million in funding for education outside of the base student allocation formula. The state has been flat funding education for a number of years, and we know that that essentially passively cuts education over time. We're not keeping up with inflation, especially in rural Alaska, where we have significantly high teacher turnover and administrative turnover. You know, they've been dealing with increasing class sizes, and now we're seeing all of this pressure to ensure that new teachers that are coming out into our areas are able to provide distance delivered education. So making sure that we have a strong, robust education budget is something that I think would be a priority for a lot of Alaskans. So I was really disappointed to see that veto. The governor also vetoed Online with Libraries. That's a program that helps to to provide equitable access to Alaskans, whether they're using a video teleconference network essentially they're using a video teleconference network at their local public library. This really has big impacts in the North Slope region, where roughly 45% of the demand for that program has been in North Slope and Arctic regions of the state. And so those communities, like I've mentioned before, are going to be hit hardest. Senator Kiehl talked about the marine highway system and how that impacts rural Southeast communities. With regard to transportation vetoes that happened in the budget in my district, the governor vetoed 2 appropriations made for transportation. I recognize the importance of the marine highway system. It's very similar in some parts of my district where the only way to connect in and out of a community is by small airline service. One of my villages in particular in Quinnahock on the Bering Sea, they do not have safe runway conditions. And so we had provided less than $100,000 to put into the budget to provide maintenance and operation support to help bring that up to standard and to help make sure that the Department of Transportation ensures that Alaskans in Quinnahock have access in and out of their community, because it's causing delays in medevacs, it's causing delays in people being able to receive bypass mail. And so there is no other option. And so really when we're looking at vetoes that are impacting rural Alaska, it's not just impacting state services, it's really impacting life, health, safety conditions for hundreds and thousands of Alaskans across the state. I will add my concern to what Senator Kiehl said with regard to, the governor has told Alaskans that many of these items that have been vetoed out of the budget could be backfilled by the CARES Act. As Senator Kiehl mentioned, we're hearing that CARES Act funding has strict guardrails, and there's a lot of skepticism about whether federal funding will be able to be used for many of those programs. And so ultimately what has happened is that based on those decisions, the governor has essentially put state services in a risky, vulnerable position at a time when Alaskans need those services now more than ever. As I mentioned, in larger communities across the state, municipalities and boroughs and other forms of government are able to step in as some sort of shock absorber when the state has budget cuts that are so impactful. In rural areas like mine, made up mostly of unorganized districts with a tax base that relies solely on a small percentage of a sales tax, they're not able to absorb those cuts. And so often they go without the essential state services that they need. So that's sort of a broad overview of the impacts in rural Alaska and things that that I've been deeply concerned by. And I just really, again, appreciate the opportunity for all of the entities that have made this time for us to come together and talk about issues of importance to the state.
All right, everybody ready for me? Okay, I see a smile, so I understand you probably hear my audio. Hi, I'm Representative Chris Tuck. I'm also feel privileged to be here in front of everybody. I want to thank Alaska Native Peoples Action Group for putting this on. I serve South Central Anchorage, which is, I call it the Diamond Business District. This is South Central Anchorage. This district right here has more manufacturing, retail, warehousing, Mexican restaurants, and apprenticeship schools, I think, than anywhere concentrated in the state of Alaska. So any of this economic situation that we're having right now for the COVID crisis, my constituents feel that very, very deeply. We pretty much covered a lot of the vetoes. One of the things that I'm very disappointed in the governor's veto is the pre-kindergarten grants. I think that part of his reasoning on that is he didn't get this Alaska Reads Act. I'm not sure about that, but that's the rumors that I'm hearing. We might be able to get that back if we continue on with that piece of legislation. But overall, education is really suffering from pre-K all the way up to our university. And it's a real shame, because without a vibrant education system, it really makes Alaska's economic situation even more bleak. So what I thought I would concentrate on is a little bit on what the governor said on his veto, when he announced his vetoes, about the federal government being able to make up some of the difference and provide for the funding that he vetoed. And generally, he doesn't have that authority. The Alaska State Legislature is the appropriation body. We do have a committee called Legislative Budget and Audit Committee, in which I'm the chair of that committee. And the committee does have authorization to act on behalf of the full legislature when receiving additional funds from the federal government for existing programs that are federally funded. One of the challenges that we have is really the only budget that we passed prior to the CARES Act being passed by the federal government was our supplemental budget. So anything that's getting funded between now and July 1st, we might be able to do some additional monies, but everything after July 1st, because our budget wasn't passed until after the CARES Act was passed, That's the big question on whether or not. So it looks like that the governor's ability to add more additional funding really is down to the mental health trust budget and the supplemental budget. In the supplemental budget, it was a little bit surprising to see some of the stuff that he vetoed on that. He did veto about $31 million in Medicaid services. He also vetoed $106,000 into the trial courts. Additionally, the rural real ID implementation, he cut $150,000 from that. And then the Cold Climate Research Center, he cut $520,000 from that. And then, of course, as we talked about earlier, eliminating the community assistance deposit, we added money back into the supplemental for FY19, and he vetoed that additional $30 million. So whatever's left over in our supplemental, he can add to that. Now, on the Legislative Budget and Audit Committee, any monies that he has coming through, he would have to do what we call an RPL. And an RPL, it's kind of a fancy term. And I got to remember, I remember myself what that means. RPL is Revised Program Legislative Statute. So basically, it's basically adding any money that we have coming in for existing funds. However, if we didn't already have federal money in an existing program, for example, community revenue sharing, because there's no federal money that goes into that, the governor cannot add money from the federal government into that program, even though because he had vetoed it. So that is going to actually take full legislative action and take full action of the legislature. A lot of people were asking, well, what are the chances of the legislature coming back? And just for clarification, we're in recess that we have not adjourned yet, so we still can call ourselves back in a session. It only takes one body to go ahead and gavel in, and then the other body would be forced to come in 3 days later. But with the COVID crisis that we're having right now, and with people really concerned about getting together in large groups, it's a little bit difficult to say at this time when we might be able to come back together. We still have a few tools in our toolbox to be able to address the veto issue. We still have the capital budget out there that didn't pass. A lot of the items and getting out of Juneau early, we put into the operating budget that we had planned for the capital budget, just so that we have all that ready to go. So we still have the capital budget as a tool to be able to do what we did last year, and that was being able to pass the capital budget with adding back some of the stuff that the governor had vetoed. That's a lot easier to do with the 50% plus one vote than it is to try to get a 3/4 vote veto override. As you remember last year we didn't get a budget done till well into August. And that really hurt a lot of programs here in Alaska, that really hurt a lot of Alaskans. And we don't want to see that happen again. I'm hoping that somehow we can get back together to be able to do the same process to take advantage of that. We also have there's an idea coming up there on being able to split the permanent fund dividend rather than waiting for the full $1,000 in October, to be able to have something put out after the new fiscal year coming in after July 1st, maybe $500 then, and then another $500 in October. That's another reason why that we might be able to get back together. It depends on how our economy is doing. And it really does help out that we have those deposits happening in people's families with the $1,200 coming from the federal government. We just don't know how long that will be able to sustain people. And then we also have any type of appropriations that we may have to do for keeping our communities going with the Alaska CARES Act money coming in. So just give an example. If for example, the governor did also veto the Real ID funding to get people to get their Real ID identification so they can travel. Here in the state of Alaska, that's really important. But because we had no federal money coming into that, the $150,000 that we had coming in, he would not be able to use that money for the Real ID. So we would have to meet to do that. Probably one of his rationales is that the Real ID has been postponed till October of 21. So we have another year to do that. However, Alaska, it's much more difficult for people in rural Alaska, especially our elders, to be able to get that Real ID. So that's one of the challenges that I think that is going to cause the legislature to come back into session and be able to handle these situations. Legislative budget audit, again, is only restricted to being able to handle the things that are additional receipt authority coming in that's existing in our current budget. The governor, and I believe he knew this when he did his vetoes, because if you remember at the end of his press conference, he said, hey, when I do my COVID update at 5 o'clock, I don't want to take any more questions on the veto overrides. And I think it's because he gave out his vetoes just moments before having his press availability, and the press never had a chance to be able to look into it and be able to ask the proper questions. But when he said that we can make up these programs through federal receipts, we really can't. There's very limited opportunity for us to do that. But the 1.25 billion that's coming in for each state, that will have to take some appropriations from the legislature. So there's a lot in the Alaska CARES Act that's going to benefit Alaskans. Part of the stuff that they have right now is there's funds that will go to the state directly. And those funds, for example, the unemployment benefits, that'll go to the state directly. There are some funds that are going to be going to non-state entities, and that's tribal and local governments and owners of medical hospitals. Additionally, there's going to be federal funds going to federal agencies, and the federal agencies will be able to handle each particular state's different programs that will be available. And then there's a bunch of general items of interest that got passed also. One of them I already mentioned, extending the Real ID Act. Another one is being able to provide direct payments of the $1,200 plus $500 per dependent. Another one is the Small Administration Services Administration being able to offer emergency grants up to $10,000 to provide immediate relief for operating costs that can cover 6 months of payments for businesses with existing SBA loans. And then we have one thing that we may be able to get reestablished is because the governor did cut public broadcasting, is there will be some, from the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, some fiscal stabilization grants. So that might help us out in our rural areas for public television and for radio stations to the tune of about 75 million. So that's one area that he may be correct, that he may be able to have some federal funds for the veto that he made there. And then it also requires COVID-19 testing in our health plans and the things that we have going on. So with that, I will just make myself available for questions also. I'm kind of just basically focused on what legislative budget audit can do from this moment on with the vetoes that we have and the federal money that we can come into the state of Alaska.
Great, thank you all for that really informative information. I just want to do a quick opportunity. I know we have a few other legislators online. Just the legislators want to say hello, introduce yourself, and which area you're from. I just want to recognize that you're here and joining us too.
Hi, this is Senator Elvie Gray Jackson, and I'm just really honored to be here, and I appreciate all the comments that my colleagues have made, and I echo them. And with that said, I really don't have anything to add at this point, but I, again, appreciate being able to be here with you all. Thank you.
This is Tom Begich. I'm also online senator from downtown Anchorage and a minority leader of the Alaska Senate. So glad to hear the comments from everybody, and nothing to add except for that libraries funding was also cut. Necessary expansion, not expansion, necessary maintenance of rural libraries in particular. There were over 80 libraries affected by that very tiny appropriation of $635,000, and the governor, for whatever reason, felt it was necessary to also slash that money.
This is Bill Wielkowski. Just happy to be on the line and hear from everybody else. I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
Okay, I think I got everybody. So thanks again. So we've got a few questions that have been coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and read them. And then I'll just allow the legislators to jump in if you want to answer that question. So question 1 came in. Is there a legal interpretation what would allow legislators to meet telephonically to override a veto?
Well, I'll take that question because I was trying to get legislation introduced to be able to have a continuity of government when we go into recess, or when it makes it very difficult for us to be able to meet again in person. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in seeing that. There's people were worried about constitutional issues. There were no constitutional issues, but there is some parliamentary traditions, and some of those parliamentary traditions, to be able to see each other face to face, know that people are of a sound mind, that they're not under the influence of another person or under influence of anything really, and then making sure that the countenance of the person there is readable. And one of the things that when you go into the doing things electronically, we really are breaking that tradition. There are some things that we cannot do electronically, which would have to take some sort of action from the legislature, emergency action, to be able to do that, and that is moving a bill from committee. Right now, our committees can meet remotely. They can do things teleconferencely. They can't take votes except for moving a bill out of committee. So that's one of the restrictions that we have that I was hoping to be able to address before we left this last session, knowing that we may have difficulties coming back together. However, there are ways that we can still do it. There's, if you look at the state of, I think it was Alabama, and you look at, they had a picture in the newspaper of people meeting in one of their arenas, their sports arenas, and they kept distances between everybody within 6 feet. They were still able to handle their affairs. I believe that there's still a way that we can do that without having to go telephonically at this time until we decide to pass legislation to allow ourselves to do that in an emergency situation. And, you know, we do have the Terry Miller building. I understand that the Centennial Hall down in Juneau is being used much similar to the Sullivan Arena here in Alaska, where a homeless is being sheltered. So the Terry Miller building, as long as we have 12 feet distance between one another, so when someone needs to go talk to a microphone, we have a couple of mics on the stand, they can walk over to a microphone and not break that 6 foot barrier. So I believe there's still a way that we can do it, and I hope that we can.
All right, thanks for that. Oh, go ahead, Tiffany.
I would just add, Kendra, you probably know this well, having worked in the building for a long time, but one thing that I really appreciate about Chris Tuck is he has a binder of all the magic things and procedures and process, and he knows that stuff really well. I would say that just to echo what he said, I don't think any Alaskan or any governing body or even the federal government, I don't think any of us could have understand or even known at the time when this pandemic started taking roost, and really getting settled in our country, what those implications could be, what they would be. I think that it's still to be determined. We're hearing, at least when I'm not on information overload, what I'm hearing is that potentially in some parts of the country, the peak for this initial surge of the pandemic, that we're reaching that, but that I think is still to be determined here in Alaska, in our rural communities. And so for the foreseeable future, until there's, really quality medical treatments, until we can see a vaccine, some of our only protections that we have are social distance and staying 6 feet apart and washing our hands. And, in the Capitol building, it's really difficult to be able to maintain that. And so, how do we conduct ourselves and our work in a way that allows us to protect the health and well-being of one another, but also our communities? I had made the decision, because I live in a rural community, to shelter in place for the time being in Juneau, to make sure that I'm not a vector to bring any sort of virus to my community. And so, I've really appreciated the efforts that Representative Tuck and others have taken to try to figure out over kind of the longer term plan, how can we meet in a way that allows us to conduct our work remotely. And I think with the rise in technology, we can get there, but it takes time, and our rules require us to at least convene in person to be able to make that happen. And so I think, like Chris said, more to come on that.
I think I would add, this is Tom Begich, that Senator Kiehl and the Senate leadership have been talking with our legal about the possibility of a quasi-convening process. I'll get more detail on that tomorrow. My caucus and I will, either tomorrow or the day after. But essentially looking at ways to set up managers at LIOs, and so that people could be physically present but conducting business as though they were in floor sessions. She's just beginning to explore that now, and that is a possibility as a hybrid possibility.
And I'll just say that I think that, you know, a lot of those concerns Representative Tuck talked about with really a straight online system are incredibly valid and incredibly important when you consider some of the dark chapters in Alaska's history legislatively. I think the whole situation really speaks to the importance of working together on these issues. Anything we would need to do that would change our procedures in the ways that we've discussed here, you know, it takes 2/3 vote in each body to suspend the uniform rules. And we've had a hard time from time to time as legislators coming up with that because it's a very broad level of agreement. And that's important, right? It protects everybody's rights and the Alaskans we represent. So that's one of the reasons it's so critical that we work together. And I think the folks on this call have a great track record of working together, and that the governor work collaboratively with the legislature, and that we minimize the opposition and the fighting as much as possible. If there is a broadly agreeable approach, something that the vast majority of Alaskans can get together on, we can get a lot more done much more quickly, and therefore in the age of coronavirus much more safely than if we're going to have to fight this out and you know, bang ideas against one another in rigorous debate until we have a majority. So I think there are opportunities to do this well. Everyone needs to be careful about taking them.
Okay, great. Thank you for those responses. I'm going to go to the next question about the university. Is the $25 million cut to the University of Alaska beyond the gradual cuts negotiated by the Board of Regents and the governor last year?
I brought that up. I'll just jump in. No, but I wouldn't call them gradual. You know, they constitute a pretty massive reduction in higher ed in Alaska. It is in keeping with the governor's post-veto, pre-recall. He calls it an agreement with the regions. If you ever read it, the regions said, we agree this is your plan. And so, you know, it reflects what he imposed last year and all of the damage to Alaska's future that will entail.
All right, next question. Can NEA funding support public radio?
Sorry, what was that question again?
Can NEA funding support public radio?
NEA Alaska funding?
Well, if any organization wants to fund public radio, I don't think there's any restrictions on that. There isn't any state funds that go directly into, if they're talking about the National Education Association, that's the only thing I can think of about NEA.
This is Barry. I'm just chiming in. It's National Endowment for the Arts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Oh, I was going to say that's a federal funding stream. And so one of the reasons it's critical to have state funding of public radio, public broadcasting, as Representative Zulkosky mentioned, is that non-federal money, state money, unlocks a significant amount of federal funding for public broadcasters. But the feds are pretty clear. You can't use federal money, for instance, the National Endowment for the Arts, as the match for other federal money. And so that's not an option that we would have either, A, as a state to redirect where NEA puts its grants, but B, the corporation, National Public Broadcasting grant maker, the federal grant maker, would not accept that as match.
Well, and to add to that, to what Senator Kiehl just mentioned, we saw that happen exactly with the Alaska State Arts Council last year, where the governor had vetoed that funding for the Alaska State Arts Council, and as a result, Alaska could not qualify for the federal funding that could come in. I would add, you know, I do a lot of close work with Bethel Community Services Foundation, which is the local community philanthropic organization in my hometown, which then of course does a lot of work with Rasmussen Foundation and other private philanthropy arms across the country. And I would just say that, especially as the state examines what is an essential state service, in addition to making sure that we're providing state matching funds, there is simply not enough cash in many parts of our country or in certain parts of our state to be able to provide philanthropic resources that can fill all of those gaps. There are too many services that have been decimated, whether it's been over time or in this particular fiscal year, that could keep Alaska from really being able to fill those gaps across the board.
All right, next question here. It's a little bit longer. I would like to know what epidemiology modeling is being used to strategize economic reopening. We need to have a preemptive understanding that reopening market interactions will increase COVID transmission and likely lead to transmission spikes. How is state government planning on mitigating and responding to these reintroduction spikes?
Actually, I think that's a very good question. And that's the question I think that really needs to be answered. And it needs to be answered by the governor and the legislature. We need to know under what conditions can we start re-implementing our economy, phase in our economy, and so that we maintain public health and public safety, as well as keep our economy thriving. I would imagine that if we can, if we see, I mean, this is my what I would like to see is at least 1 week's worth of either flattening the curve or actually going a downward trend. One of the problems that we've had here in America is not having enough tests, and we have that same problem here in Alaska. So you don't really know by the time you get your test results back, because we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, whether or not we're seeing the curve going up or see the curve going down, because we're not being able to evaluate that in real time. Nor are we able to evaluate it on a grand scale. We're just being able to take just a small representation of a small population. So it's really hard. I mean, you can be testing now and showing that you're in a decline, but what's actually happening is you're having a burst in the virus spread. Likewise, you can be showing that you're having a burst in the COVID spread. However, you're actually in a decline. So I think it's going to have to be a factor of one of three things. One is being able to maintain a flat line or a downward curve for a period, having a vaccination, or being able to have enough tests to be able to evaluate where you're at right now.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with Rep. Tuck's comments. I think Dr. Zink with the Department of Health and Social Services is doing a lot of epidemiological modeling to know what the virus is doing in Alaska. I would say that the legislature, it's difficult to be able to have tools similar to responding to the economic impacts. I don't know that any sort of modeling, at least I'm not aware of any particular modeling that's been enacted to help us see the particular tension points between the COVID-19 protective measures and what's happening in the economy. You know, I've seen here in Alaska where health organizations are able to expand their testing criteria right now. And so as Rep. Tuck mentioned, because we're able to expand testing criteria, it's going to look as though, potentially, as though there are going to be increases when in actuality, we're just making those tests more readily available. And so, you know, I agree that, especially in, you know, remote parts of the state, like where I come from, those surges can happen fast and they can happen quickly because there's such a small population. And so I think it's really important that as we consider protective measures, and we heard the governor announce yesterday he's reopening elective procedures in the state, that he is looking at opening certain parts of the economy. I remain concerned because I've not seen any trends. I think we're just starting to see the trend in some of the modeling that Dr. Zink is doing, where we're starting to see the flattening of the curve, but has that been sustained? I don't know that that question has been answered. And so, you know, we're really looking to the administration to answer the question of how are we going to, number one, protect Alaskans, and number two, protect our economy.
And this, just to add briefly, this is a situation where the legislature has pretty limited powers. This is a declared disaster emergency, which gives extraordinary power to the executive. So it is vitally important that they not play politics, that they keep it straight on the level. I think that Dr. Zink, by and large, has done a tremendous job of tempering any tendency that way. And I was really pleased to see the one thing that had been out of keeping with that professional guidance now be withdrawn by virtue of opening up elective procedures. So in a situation where we give the executive such extraordinary power, they have a public trust. They can't afford to violate it, because the success of our efforts as Alaskans really depends on every Alaskan doing what needs to be done. I share Representative Tuck's concerns, Representative Zulkosky's concerns. We're still under, I think, 300 total cases in a state of 700 and some odd thousand people. And we are so, we have so many villages, so many places with one or two routes in or out, that we haven't seen the kind of widespread that you see in closely, broadly networked places elsewhere in the country. That's a good thing. I'm thrilled. I am deeply concerned that if we open up too quickly, without the kind of testing we need, without the kind of contact tracing and follow-up we need, we could see that sort of transmission happen. And we lag so much in being able to catch it. I mean, there are no good choices right now. And you've heard that in my colleagues' comments. So thank you for the question. I think it reflects an important concern and caution that so far I think we're seeing from the executive branch. And critical as I've been of them and other things, I can't by and large criticize their approach here.
All right, I'll go to the next question. Does legislative leadership have a list of targeted requests for Alaska future congressional relief packages that they are communicating with our congressional delegation?
I don't think there's anything formally written. At least I haven't seen anything. However, I know that we all share the same concerns, and there's been some dialogue going back and forth from individual legislators to our individual congressional delegation. And, you know, a lot of it's unemployment insurance, making sure that we have possibilities there for someone who is in the gig economy, whether they're an Uber driver or self-employed in some way, that they can have some unemployment insurance benefits during this time of crisis. Making sure that when people self-quarantine, that they can still receive unemployment insurance from the federal level. Also making sure that monies get into our communities as expected. So there's a lot of conversations happening. There's a lot of regulations being written very quickly at the federal level also to address the concerns, not just from our state, from all states. So things are happening very quickly at the federal level, which I'm actually pretty impressed. I was impressed that they were able to get the CARES Act out, something that comprehensive, as fast as they did. Now it's all the regulations and all the sidebars that go along with some of these funds. And so there's continual dialogue going back and forth to make sure the state's needs are being met at the same time.
To shift away from the funding issue, the other issue that obviously is going to be affected by all this at the federal level has to make some action on or take some action on is going to be the census and how we conduct the census. We know that they're already delaying the process for up to 3 months or 4 months, depending on, it's 120 days, so I guess 4 months. But the issue is twofold. We've done some letters to our delegation about the disparate processes that were being used in the census before COVID-19. But now with the virus and the delays, the potential of the impact of that census not being conducted either fairly or in a manner that's safe has to be considered. So there's beyond just the immediate needs of economy and unemployment, there's also these long-term needs that we're communicating with the congressional delegation about that may or may not be relevant to that question.
And on that point, Tom, I think it's important, we've got a good captive audience here to talk about real quick the importance of the census and why we need to make sure that we're counting everybody and why it's important to fill out that information.
Well, in particular, well, there's two reasons. The primary reason that you want to be taking care of the census or making sure that the census is done is that we do it brings in up to $12 billion a year over a decade to the state, not a year, but over a decade. And that disproportionately would go against rural Alaska based on both the questions of how we're allocating or how we're allocating or guiding smaller communities where, how we're allocating them under differential representation, which is a process that we just wrote a letter to the congressional delegation about today. We're taking villages in rural Alaska and allocating them to larger urban areas through this new process, which is really going to disproportionately impact those villages. But then the secondary reason beyond just the financial reasons are, of course, reapportionment and the impact that has on our legislative, potentially our legislative makeup. If in fact the federal government doesn't resolve things like the differential issue, we could end up reducing the total number of count in rural Alaska if we don't do the census, if we don't actually respond to the census, we could undercount our rural residents in particular, but also our lower income residents in the urban areas, and disproportionately weight the representation in the state of Alaska to those who are wealthier, those who are white, and those who are urban. So those are three things are two major issues to consider: the funding and the reapportionment. And then within the reapportionment issue, the dreadful impact that could have on not just constituencies that represent our least served members of the population, but also, quite frankly, our more progressive constituencies.
And I would just add, Kendra, that as Senator Begich was talking about political representation, that's what, essentially at the end of the day, it's elected officials that are the appropriating bodies for the state and really making those decisions on where the state spends its money and what programs are important to the communities. And so that's why it's so critical to participate, not just because every uncounted Alaskan essentially over a 10-year period is a loss of roughly $30,000 to the state in a decade, but because it just means less political power for those rural areas that are really reliant on programs that keep our communities together and keep our communities functioning.
Thank you for elaborating on that one. I just think that's an important part to make sure that we're getting out there of why to participate in the census and really what it means. Going on to another question. Can lawmakers engage the governor about the infrastructure bill and see how closely that will align with the STIP? Who wants to take that one?
I don't know if I have an answer for that one.
Universal excitement about that one, you can tell. Each of us, I suspect, is independently engaging in different ways where we think we can do the best job for our regions and our constituents. Certainly, as one of my colleagues, I think Representative Tuck mentioned, that individual legislators are contacting the congressional delegation. The STIP is a notorious sore spot for legislators because it is under the executive branch's control, and they program and reprogram federal transportation money, sometimes without us, sometimes over our objections. And so I think those of us who think we have any influence over the sovereign republic of DOT are engaging them on a regular basis. If there's going to be an infrastructure bill, obviously there will be there may be certain projects lined out in it. There may be increased allocations to states. And so we're going to have to work with the congressional delegation and work collectively as legislators to make sure that the funds get put where they're going to do the most good for Alaskans. We don't always agree amongst ourselves on that. It's no surprise to anyone that the projects in one district, to the extent they might crowd out projects in another, have different values to different legislators. But by and large, we do a reasonably good job of getting together. Certainly, you know, you see a lot of perspective among most legislators. Most folks, you know, Representative Zulkosky was a shining example, right, of how she has been supportive of the marine highway system. There are no state ferries that dock in her district. In turn, when she talks about the need for infrastructure projects and transportation safety projects in the Delta, man, we listen because she knows the district. So we'll continue to work together and work on the administration to make sure that there's a statewide perspective and that the most Alaskans' needs are met there.
I was also asked if you could elaborate just a little bit on the STIP program.
Oh God, somebody else do it. I've already talked too much.
Statewide Transportation Improvement Program. So we'll just leave it there. We'll put up some more information about that and send it out if that works.
Yeah, and I just want to add that there is some significant money that's been vetoed out of the Department of Transportation and Public Facilities budget. Of course, the biggest one there is the Alaska Marine Highway at the tune of $15 million. But then we also have Central Highways and Aviations to the tune of about 140 plus 140,000 plus some additional cuts in that area. The AIA field and equipment maintenance of another $50,000. So I mean, as Representative Zulkosky had pointed out, the importance of having our airports maintained out in rural Alaska. And again, I want to remind everybody that we still have the capital budget, that we're still in recess. We still have opportunities to be able to negotiate with the governor, come back in this session, however way that we can do it, the best way that we can do it to get some of these vetoes overridden through adding it back into the capital budget and, you know, working with the governor, because as we all know, infrastructure is the veins and vessels of our economy. And it's very important that as we open up our economy, that those veins and vessels are healthy.
Moving on to a little bit different topic, elections. There was an effort, and I do believe this was actually put in a bill, to allow the administration or the lieutenant governor to put in a vote by mail if this pandemic is still going on. And so the question was, how comfortable are you with the division of elections that can carry out and secure a vote by mail should this be necessary this year?
Well, this is going to be new territory for the legislature, I mean, for the state government. Anchorage municipal elections, they've been doing this our second cycle now with vote by mail. So that's roughly half the population of the state of Alaska. So we'll hopefully have that assistance from the municipality to be able to do it effectively statewide. There are concerns about trying to get something off the ground because there was a lot of research that went into having the Anchorage municipal elections handled that way. So hopefully there's a lot of dialogue going on between the municipality of Anchorage and the Division of Elections in trying to come up with a process, make sure they have the equipment, make sure they have the personnel, and make sure they have the ability to do this. We did in Senate Bill 241 get May language in there to allow the primary and general elections and all elections during this emergency order done by mail. It'd be nice to see if if we are able to do that, if it's necessary, and be able to do it effectively. There is concerns also with rural Alaskans being able to get their mail on time and also be able to send their mail, their ballots back on time. There's also concerns about integrity of the ballots. But we know that other states have done it very effectively. I believe it's something that we can do, but the question is what would be the quality of these next few elections if we have to go by vote, if we have to do a vote by mail system?
I would add that onto what Chris had mentioned, you know, at least I've heard overwhelmingly from a lot of my colleagues from the Anchorage area how vote by mail has really increased voter turnout in places like Anchorage, and how people are really engaged in the elections process when they can just easily return their ballot. I think, like Chris mentioned, there's a lot of questions about how is this implemented? How is it implemented in areas where Alaska Native languages are typically provided for support, whether it's interpreting a ballot or there's a local translator that's available at a polling place. You know, in my region, you know, outside of just my house district, but in my region as a whole, there's 18 communities that are now without any scheduled passenger or cargo service because of the closure of Raven Airlines, and that also impacts the mail service. So, you know, if those types of closures and gaps in service continue, being able to get to receive the ballot, let alone to make sure that it gets returned within a reasonable time frame, is to be determined. I think it was an important step for the legislature to include permissibility language in Senate Bill 241. I think that it's important that the Division of Elections has every resource to make that available in the state if we need to. But I think that there are a lot of questions, like was previously mentioned, about the integrity of whether a vote by mail could be launched so quickly on a tight turnaround, especially in communities that may need additional language translation support, or has interruptions in their service resulting from economic impacts to this pandemic.
Yeah, and just like a quick comment, I think we have to really think about too is the partnerships that we have with our tribes, and knowing that they can have an important role in this as well. I truly believe in like the government-to-government relationships with tribes, and making sure that we're working with local communities, that people on the ground can help, not just in elections, but, you know, just using the elections as an example of, you know, working with our tribes, ensuring that they may have ballots, and we're getting translation services. So I do agree that there's a lot of things that needs to be done if they were to roll out a vote by mail system, and just really looking at those relationships that I think that we've talked about a lot, and especially this year and in tribal affairs, which I appreciate, is how do we build and strengthen those relationships? And I think that this is another important one to be looking at.
This is Elvie. I really appreciate everybody's comments on the vote by mail issue. I was heavily involved with the vote by mail process at the municipality level. It took us several years to get it right, dealing with all the different issues. So I'm a little bit concerned, especially considering the fact that one of the first things that I tried to do was get a bill working with Senator Begich and others to allow vote by mail, and then getting all the different legal opinions with different issues that came up. But I heard that Kiehl is working with Barbara Jones right now, and I really hope she is, and I'm going to confirm that, because if she starts now, it should work. Thank you.
And I'll just add on, I mean, Senator Gray Jackson said it. Alaskans have done this. Alaskans can do this. My friend John Lindback was Chief of Staff to Lieutenant Governor Fran Ulmer in the Knowles Ulmer administration. He went off to the state of Oregon and oversaw their transition as director of the Oregon Division of Elections, transition to vote by mail. Alaskans know how to do this. It needs to start now, but with as little as we know about what the state of this virus will be in August and in November, I think the only responsible case is to start preparing immediately. And those partnerships that you mentioned are going to be key. And the expertise of clerks like Ms. Jones in Anchorage, folks like John Lindback in Oregon, I have no question that Alaskans can do this. They can count every ballot. It can be safe, and everyone can have access.
All right, looks like we've got time for one more question, and it's actually going back to talk about the census. It says, we filled out an online form. Does this mean no one will knock on our door? Are these two data collection methods part of the same survey? And if they are the same, can't we just reach out to villages and other people who might be missed to submit an online form, even if it is over the phone? Oh, it looks like Senator Baggage needs to be unmuted.
I was saying I think Very needs to answer that question, actually. And she probably has the best answer to that particular question, I would think. Very?
Well, you've called me out, but I'm happy to take a crack at it. Hi, everyone. I am the director of ACPERG, and we work on the census with many of the partners and elected representatives here and senators. And for the census, the online response form does replace responding in person as well as responding by telephone. They want to give you as many options to answer as possible. And if you haven't received your access code, you can still respond to the census. Online, there's a little hyperlink beneath where you would normally answer your access code. And it says, don't have your access code, answer here. And they just ask you a few more questions about your location to determine that it's actually you. But the sort of upshot of all of that is that they have ways to make sure that they're not reduplicating answers. They're extending the timeline actually for when they're going to end the census count. It looks like it might be closer to Halloween. So please don't dress up as Census Bureau enumerators, but they're really trying their best to have a full count, which is very difficult because they've stopped all of their in-person enumeration. And they're trying to figure out right now better ways to communicate with especially villages, which they haven't decided yet, but hopefully they will. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go to alaskacount.org, which is a sort of massive coalition of a bunch of Alaskan organizations and just a bunch of different people and concerned community members who want to make sure that everyone gets counted. So please message me in the chat box and I'm happy to answer more questions about that.
Great, thank you, Very. And maybe post that website in the comments too so people can take a look at it. Alaska Counts has a lot of really good information out there. So I guess any wrap-up comments from legislators before I do my quick wrap-up?
Well, I'll just add that there are some restrictions on that COVID money coming in, the 1.25 billion. It does have to be only for qualified COVID-19 responses. And there is a Inspector General of the U.S. Treasury that has oversight over that. So anything that's outside of basically health and social services and public safety will be scrutinized and will be questioned. And money will be owed back to the federal government if we misuse those funds in any way. And so I think that there is going to be a need for the legislature to come back together when that money gets distributed to the states. There's a lot of restrictions on there, but on the discretionary stuff, again, it can only be used on stuff that we've already have in our budget. We do have underneath the mental health budget, we do have open-ended receipt authority. So the governor may have more powers in that department than other areas. And other than that, where the money is deposited into the disaster relief fund, the legislature put in a $10 million restriction on that. So you can only spend up to $10 million without further legislative action. So I think there is going to be a need for the legislature to come back together sometime soon.
I just want to say, extend my appreciation again to Native Peoples Action and ACPERG and all of the organizations that sponsored this conversation today. I think, Alaska was in a, as I mentioned before, we were in a tough fiscal environment before this pandemic. I think we're in even more of a difficult position resulting from this pandemic. You know, I was doing some messaging out to my district earlier this week and was working with my staff, and we were talking about how we're physically distant, but we're all in this together. And a couple of times over the course of this meeting, I've clicked through to see all the faces and names that are here together today. And, you know, we are here because we're committed to Alaskans. I do this work because I feel a strong sense of obligation to my district, to my region, to rural Alaska, to Alaska Native people in our state, and to our state as a whole. And I think even though we're met with great uncertainty, even though there's a lot of anxiety, whether it's about our physical condition or about our state's economic condition, there's a lot of people that really care and just really appreciate the opportunity to talk about items of importance to us that we're following, but to really allow people to engage with us and have conversations with us. So thank you for the time and the space to do that today.
And let me just echo those comments. It's really a privilege to serve with the legislators who came on this call, who put their time where their values are. You know, Senator Zulkosky, Senator Gray Jackson, Senator Begich, Representative Zulkosky and Tuck. The fact that they are here really tells you that your voices and your thoughts matter, and I think that's important. These are tough times, and for all that we're focused on the coronavirus now, the simple fact is that our budget is going to be in dire straits next. We didn't raise any revenue this year. The price of oil is in the trough, and our permanent fund is on its heels. So we are in great risk in Alaska that next year, if we don't make the hard decisions and make them fast, the governor, frankly, will get the budget he wanted last year and then some out of necessity. We can't afford to let that happen. That's not the Alaska we want to live in. That's not the Alaska that our parents left us and that we want to leave to our children and grandchildren. So as we all get together and get through this current situation with the coronavirus, know that we have more challenges ahead and that nobody meets challenges together like Alaskans. I've got every confidence that the folks on this call, not just the legislators, but each of you, has the fortitude and the smarts to help us get it done together. Thanks everyone for taking all your time.
There we go. I was muted. All right. Well, thank you. I just want to extend my appreciation for everyone that's been online, providing questions, especially to the legislators, to be here and just offering up this information. I think it's important that we learn what's going in the budget, what's going on in our legislature, but I also want to extend to everyone on how important it is to reach out with your legislators. You can see that they're here, they're people who are easy to talk to. A lot of times I get questions on how do we engage with our legislators? Can I call them? Can I email them? And I say, absolutely. They need to hear from you. And I think it's really important that people are continuing to provide you information. So I just want to say, make sure you can go to akleg.gov and find everybody's contact information. You know, send them questions, talk to them. They're really easy to talk to. And we hope to hold more forums like this going forward, so we can really just have these good dialogues and opportunities for public to have questions. I know these are pretty crazy times right now, and we're balancing a lot. And one thing I can say I've appreciated about this is I'm getting to know a lot of people's families. So there are ways that we're connecting. We're seeing people's houses look like, we're seeing our families and our dogs. And so getting to know each other in a much different way. So there's that going for us, so we can think about. I wanted to also encourage anyone to reach out to our organizations, Native People's Action, Native Movement, Alaska Center, Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, and ACPIRG. If you have additional questions, Feel free to send any one of us an email and we'll work on getting answers to you for the budget, for legislation. We really are here to be connectors and to help and to provide information. We're constantly putting stuff up on our websites, sharing information so you can like our Facebook pages. Just feel free to reach out to us, reach out to your legislator. And I think that's all I have, Gunesh Chish. Just thank you so much again for everybody coming. And I'm also hearing that Louis has something he wants to add.
Muted. Am I muted?
Nope, you're good. I can hear you.
Oh, good. Yeah, thanks everyone. My name is Louis Flora with the Alaska Center. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to address the audience here. Largely there's a lot of advocacy organizations on this call, and I did want to get a message out and your opinion on what the best way that we can proceed to advocate for overriding the vetoes or advocating for the budgets to be reinstated. What's your opinion on what we can do right now?
Well, we have always the usual: contact your legislator, make a phone call, email, write a letter. But, one of the things too is having dialogue is very important, and not just dialogue with your legislator, but dialogue with one another too. You need to educate your family members, your neighbors, and everything else on issues that are important, not only to you, but to Alaskans. And then, because it's through dialogue that we will solve a lot of the state's issues right now and come out of this economic crisis that we're seeing. So the only other piece of advice I have besides the usual advice is just basically have dialogue with one another. Everyone's hunkered down. Everyone's focusing on the economy. We're focusing on the direction of the state of Alaska. It's a good time to capture people and have those very important dialogues. People are less busy now, unfortunately, because of our situation, but people are looking to other people to speak. And I would like to say that being hunkered down in self-quarantine for a while, it really is very good to see everybody's faces on this TV. I never thought how much I missed the interaction, but I really enjoy this format and really do appreciate seeing everyone's faces out there.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us for a great webinar, and I hope everyone stays safe and healthy.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Go.
Hi. Hello.